tonight. This is the first event for Academic Rep Conference. It's really exciting. It's great to see a lot of you here. We're really fortunate to be joined by Jim Dickinson today. He has only over 20 years of experience in the higher education sector and in the representation of students as a whole. He was the former director of NUS and a CEO at UEA University, so he has a wealth of knowledge of the wider sector and widely contested issues as a whole. So today he's going to be talking about tuition fees and value for money, as I'm sure he'll give you a brief overview in a second. So without further ado, I'll hand over to him. But thank you all for joining, and I hope you enjoyed the session.
Great, thanks, Alyssa. Fantastic to be invited again. So thank you. If only I could be there in person. If you can say one thing about Royal Holloway, it's always worth a visit to campus. So kind of gutted that this year it's online, but not nearly as gutted as doubtless those of you that are on the call are about being kind of prevented from being on campus for most of the year. More generally, I can't promise, unlike Alyssa's introduction, that I will be brief. Because this is a complicated subject, but what I will try to do is build in time for questions. So I'll go at quite a pace on this, but very, very happy to sort of take questions and get a discussion going at the end. So feel free to put those in the kind of chat function, or to use the question function on Teams, or whatever it is that you want to do, or save them up for the end, however you want to do this. So what are students paying for? I've decided to kind of entitle this. And it was interesting because when Alyssa emailed me, she said, can you do these things? She actually said more than this. She said, can you cover, there were a few more bullets, but I took a few out. So these are some of the things I'm going to try and address in the next sort of 45 minutes to an hour-ish. So what is value for money, and what are students paying for when they commit to over £9,000 a year in fees? That is, of course, the kind of 9K figure, the home undergraduate figure. Some of you may well be postgraduate taught students. Some of you may well be international students. But obviously, for those of you in the home undergraduate fee system, what are students paying for when they pay their 9,250? How are tuition fees determined? Really interesting question. That's not a complicated one to answer, actually, but I'll explain some of the history and so on. Whose responsibility is it to ensure tuition fee rates are fair? An absolutely fascinating question. Partly because understanding the kind of notions and concept of fairness is really tricky on this one. Is it realistic for universities to refund students money without government support? Really good question. How should the government be supporting students this year? Really good question. I could do a whole hour just on that. And what could be done to help students? I will try and get there as best I can. So do you know what? There's lots of places you can start with this, but I thought I would start here, which is to remind us that that students are in debt. Home undergraduates will leave their 3-year traditional degree having taken out a maintenance loan and a tuition fee loan, and in your case, a kind of higher maintenance loan than lots of people can take out around the country, because for long, historical and complicated reasons, Royal Holloway counts for the purposes of London weighting. You come out with a significant amount of debt, although it's a very special kind of debt. And let's just remind ourselves at the outset some of the kind of unique features of that debt. First of all, one of the things that really kind of surprises some students on graduation is that they've been paying interest on their loans since the day they took each loan out. So it adds up to more than they thought they borrowed when they get the first the figure in the bottom right hand corner of their student loans company statement. Interest is charged from day one at RPI, which is the measure of inflation, plus 3%, Then it drops back to RPI as soon as they graduate and climbs back up to RPI plus 3% once their graduate salary is at £41,000. Quite a complicated system, but interest is there. It's written off after 30 years. After 30 years, if you haven't paid it all off, the remaining amount's written off. You don't start paying any of it back until you're earning, at the moment, 27,295 quid. And there's a repayment rate of 9% of the amount you earn over the threshold, and 6% of the amount you earn over the threshold if you've also taken out a postgraduate loan in the state-backed system, PGT loan. So it's not a normal debt, but it is a debt. But it's not a normal debt. It's a kind of graduate contribution debt, but it is a debt. So it's a very interesting kind of loan. And that system, the reason why it was put in place, the complexity of kind of meddling with it, how expensive that system is, that system that you can see on the screen right now underpins almost all of the kind of debates and complexity and difficulty that surrounds the student loan system, why tuition fee refunds are so difficult, the controversy that surrounds this academic year, and so on. So,
Jim, sorry, just quickly, your screen has your screen has stopped sharing.
Oh, right, okay. Let's. That's very odd, isn't it? Shall I just fix that somehow? Is it back?
To ruin your flow.
Is it back?
Yes, there we go. Thank you.
Right, fantastic. Okay, good. So yeah, so just in case you hadn't caught that because it wasn't on the screen, interest, write-off, repayment threshold, repayment rate, plus of course the amount that you take out in maintenance loans and tuition fees. Okay, and that's for obviously for home students, different for international students, and so on. Slightly more complicated for PG loans, and so on and so on. Now, there are lots of ways in which you can look at this system, right? You can have different optics on this system. One really interesting way of looking at it, I think, is working out how much that is paid for that system between graduates and government. So in other words, by the end of it, how much has government chipped in for that amount that's been taken out in a loan, and how much have graduates chipped in through the graduate repayment system? Okay, so up until 2011, it was about 40-60. Okay, total upfront spending on higher education, about 40% was paid for by graduates, about 60% by government. And what changing the fee system to £9,000 did was effectively flip that on its head. Okay, so it moved quite quickly from 65%, some 30, about 40% place 60% to about 65 place 35. So in other words, if you see in the middle there, for most of the last decade, graduates were putting in about 65% and government put in 35%. And what government would say is that allowed far more students to go to university. And it's only really the richest that paid the most, and so on and so on. Now, something very interesting then happened in 2017. Some of you, certainly if you're a home student, some of you will recall that Theresa May, remember her, when she turned up to Conservative Party conference one year, lost her voice. And behind her, as she did her speech, the letters fell down. It was quite a dramatic day, kind of led the news agenda for 24 hours. But one of the things that most people didn't spot in that speech, partly because the letters fell down and she lost her voice, is that she moved the graduate repayment threshold, and she moved it up. And instantly that made the system much more expensive than it had previously been assumed to be. And what that meant was that it moved from, as you can see there, 65-35 to 53-47. And that's because people in their 20s weren't paying back any of their student loan, largely because people in their 20s were suddenly, thanks to Theresa May, not hitting the repayment threshold. So you can see, I think, that when you fiddle with any of these aspects of the loan system, interest, total amount, write-off, threshold, repayment rate, it becomes more or less expensive for the Treasury. And the Treasury worries about this sort of thing for, I guess, fairly obvious reasons. So that's those. Now, a few other optics to look at this through. One of the optics is how much does it cost us as a society to put a student into higher education? So how much do we spend per full-time student? And here's an interesting graph. So this is a graph that shows the total amounts that we put in per full-time student compared to a bunch of kind of competitor countries. And as you can see, it's only really the United States that spends more per full-time student than us. And that's not to say, you know, this is combining state and private sources of income, tuition fees, and the state's contribution. This is how much is kind of goes into a university per full-time student. So we actually have quite an expensive system, and there's two reasons for that. One, we are obsessed with students leaving home to go to university, what some people call the boarding school model of higher education, what other people call the Harry Potter HE model of university education, right? And I think, you know, there's probably no university that more closely embodies in its marketing material the cliche of Harry Potter HE than Royal Holloway, with you know, founders and those fantastic photographs and where you have your summer ball and so on, right? So we have an obsession in the UK with students leaving home to go to university. More students leave home to go to university proportionally than almost any other country. That brings costs, okay, because the maintenance system has to be invested in and subsidized. Second reason is we have more students on research-led teaching degrees rather than just teaching degrees, where researchers, academics are doing research in order to inform their teaching, and our class sizes tend to be smaller. So add all of that up and we have quite an expensive system. Now, if you therefore have a population spike, in other words, if the number of 18-year-olds that are roaming around starts to increase for population reasons, for historic population reasons, that can make the system start to look more and more expensive. And one of the things that had been happening over the past 4 or 5 years is that we were going through a population spike in 18-year-olds. So demand for the expenditure from the Treasury, you know, to subsidize this whole system had been going up. And part of what all of that generates is a really interesting, I mean, this is a fascinating graph, I think. This is what the Institute for Fiscal Studies calls its education spending squid. And if you look at that line at the top, that's how much we spend per higher education student. And if you look at all the other lines, that's how much we've been spending on early years and you know, secondary school and primary school and so on and so on. And look, the reality is that higher education is expensive for the state, and has been getting, you know, got really quite expensive at the turn of the last decade and has only really leveled off. And per student, we've not been as nearly as generous with other types of education. So, you know, if you're working in the Her Majesty's Treasury, you're looking at the higher education system and thinking, that's it's an expensive game, that, isn't it? I wonder if there are any of those levers we can pull, any of those buttons we can press on the system to make it less expensive per student and therefore less expensive overall. Now, I guess what many of you would want to know is where the money goes. And the representative body of universities a couple of years ago released guidance for universities on how to communicate with students about where the money goes. And I wrote a blog about it at the time, actually, that compared it to, you know, every university wants to put out its own pizza and to show students how big each of the slices are. Your university at Royal Holloway didn't quite go for pizzas, but your university does maintain on its website 2 infographics, one on how much the university spends and one on how much income the university generates. And these efforts by universities to communicate with students about where the money goes are supposed to reassure you about whether or not you're getting value for money. Now, you know, I have a level of sympathy with universities about trying to communicate complexity, but I'm not necessarily convinced that what you're seeing on your screen right now represents a way of communicating to students that is clear, you know, obvious in terms of what it's representing, you know, tells a clear story, and so on and so on. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. But, you know, I mean, I'll give you one example, which is if you look on that screen, if you look here, bottom right hand corner, the university in this infographic to you, students at Royal Holloway, says that it spends 26.9 million quid on residencies and catering. And, you know, if you didn't really know what all these figures meant and you didn't have time to dig into it, I guess you might think, blimey, they're spending 30 million quid subsidising our catering and our halls. That isn't quite what's going on. So when you actually dig into the numbers that are supplied to the Higher Education Statistics Agency, here's what you see at Royal Holloway for the last available financial year. 22 million quid in income for halls of residence, 21 million quid, well, 21.5 million quid expenditure on halls of residence, generating a profit of £357,000, or at least a surplus. And then, you know, you can see the numbers on the right hand side then for the catering and conferencing operation. So the university certainly isn't taking £26 million and subsidising residences and catering to that number. It's spending 26 million quid, but it's not subsidising it by 26 million quid, because buried in here somewhere, other income is the income that matches that expenditure, if you see what I mean, right? So look, you know, one of the arguments goes that citizens of local councils or students of universities, or, you know, people that, you know, are members of campaigning organisations or whatever, feel that they're getting value for money if they know where the money's going. I'm not convinced that that is the best piece of work I've ever seen a university do at convincing students that the money is being spent wisely. Okay. And there's probably more that can be done when there isn't a pandemic on at being clearer about where the money goes and so on. People, though, tend to want to know about fees and where the fees money kind of comes in and goes and so on and so on. And I guess what I would say about fees generally in the higher education sector is when they introduced 9K fees, the loss on student loans, so the money that the government was going to have to write off in the end because students hadn't got round to paying, graduates hadn't got round to paying it by the time 30 years had passed, was going to be roughly 30p in the pound. So 70p was supposed to come back in. The other thing that happened right at the turn of the last decade is the assumption was not everyone would charge 9,000. So universities don't have to charge 9. They could charge 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 6.5 or whatever. And the assumption was that some universities would try to undercut students, undercut other universities and charge less, and that students would flock to them as a result. There's another, you know, webinar for another day about why that didn't work and why the tiny handful of universities that charged less than £9,000 suddenly realised that it looked like they were selling an inferior product. And so very quickly, almost everyone charged the maximum, the 9,000. It was allowed to grow a little bit partway through the decade, and he's now frozen at 9,250 quid a year. The issue, though, is because of things like that Theresa May thing I was talking about, and because of the way the economy's going, just because the fee has been frozen doesn't mean the system hasn't become much more expensive for the Treasury. So the latest estimates on non-repayment of new student loans has gone from 30% to 55%. So in other words, the Treasury only expects 45p back for every pound it lends out, which is, as you can see, very different to when the system was set up. And, you know, that's partly because of the pandemic and, you know, the recession that's coming and so on and so on. So the system now is really expensive. And to give you an example of this, last week it was revealed that the Department for Education, while squabbling around for pennies to pay free school meals and things, last week it was announced that central government has allocated DFE over £13 billion more than was projected this time last year to cover that issue. Yeah, 13 billion quid more expensive than even the system was last year gives you a sense of just how expensive higher education has started to become in the mind of government and the Treasury. Now, if you then look at it from the kind of Royal Holloway point of view and the individual student point of view, obviously, when you take out a student loan, that money goes to the university and the university can then spend it. Although it's ring-fenced, that income, that tuition fee income is ring-fenced into the university, it isn't ring-fenced for you and your course, sadly. And there are lots and lots of subsidies in play, depending on what you compare, where you compare one thing with another. So earlier on, I compared for you the money that was coming in for residencies, catering and conferencing and the money that was coming out. Fairly simple thing to do. Much harder to do for tuition fees, because what is it that you are paying for? That's the killer question. So to give you a brief sense of this, without going into too much detail, most ancillary services subsidise the core. So in other words, things like residencies, catering and conferencing very rarely get subsidised. They are normally subsidising the rest of the university. Some courses subsidise other courses. So students on sociology courses or business degrees, you are paying the bills so that students on STEM courses can study, because some of you are on courses that have very large class sizes, lots and lots of people in lecture theatres, marking is done en masse, and to some extent that helps pay for students with more expensive, more practical components to their course. Generally, when you look at the numbers, teaching subsidises research. So some of the tuition fee income gets spent on academics carrying out their research, which in theory means that what you're being taught is cutting edge, but can also sometimes mean that students argue that academics spend more time worrying about their research than supporting students through the teaching and support process. And what I can absolutely guarantee you is that in almost every mainstream university in the UK, international students are then subsidising everything, because international students pay vastly inflated amounts in comparison to the costs, however you cut it. So depending on what you've done in bullet point 1, 2 and 3 there as a university, what I can tell you is international students are almost always, with their tuition fee income, subsidising everything else through the fees that they pay. And that makes things quite interesting and complicated if you're a rep, for example, because you will be, looking after a group of students on a particular set of programs who may be, in the end, through the tuition fee income of the students you represent, subsidising other courses and students and academic faculty, schools or departments that are on this call, let alone, some of the other subsidies I've talked about. So that can get quite tricky. In terms of fees in general and how that bit works, as I say, undergraduate fees for students in the home undergraduate fee system are now £9,250 and frozen for a while. There are actually no controls on PGT fees, postgraduate taught fees, but obviously most universities don't want to charge significantly more than the total amount that's available through the postgraduate loan system. International students is a straight up market, whatever international students will pay, which obviously generates massive kind of comparison problems if you look at the amount that people are paying in comparison to home students. And PGR is a completely different subject for a different day. Postgraduate research, PhD students, completely different conversation for a different day. Invite me back and I'll explain some of that. And as I say, the state of the economy and policy changes mean that the whole system has been getting more expensive without anyone having to do anything. The other thing, though, that's interesting about all of that is demand for HE has been increasing, partly because of population and now because of COVID. So there was a fear that students wouldn't go to university because of COVID-19. Actually, what appears to be happening is that more people are applying to university because of COVID-19, because there are no jobs. And counter-cyclically, we know that whenever there's a recession, demand for education goes up because there are less employment opportunities. So the reality is that when there are more people trying to get in and then getting into university, that makes the system more expensive because there's more subsidy for the government to pay. And when you add to that the Gavin Williamson A-levels examining shambles of August 2020, where more students in the end got better grades than they were expecting. There was a degree of grade inflation caked into the system at the end of the A-level process last summer. That meant more students going to university than had previously you would have expected to, and it looks like that is going to continue again this year because they're just defaulting to teacher assessed grades. And most people believe that overall nationally that is again going to result in a degree of grade inflation. So as a result of COVID, demand is up, more people claiming more subsidy. The cost of the system is up just by standing still. There's a fear that international students won't come or can't come or will come, go home for a holiday and never come back because of the way the country's handling the pandemic, or making international students book into a Premier Inn for 2 weeks when they enter the country or whatever it is this week. And the other thing that's interesting about COVID is university costs have increased rather than decreased. Libraries are still running, staff are all still employed, extra money has been spent on tech and student hardship and so on and so on. So universities' costs have all gone up throughout the course of COVID-19. Now, when you kind of review all of that and you look at what happened last spring, the obvious question was, when Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was handing out bailouts to different sectors, the obvious question that lots of people were asking was, well, what about a bailout for students? That their part-time work has dried up, their costs will be going up, their families will have less money to support them. Living somewhere like Egham is really bloody expensive, and families will have had less money to put into their parental contribution, and universities themselves facing increased costs, making buildings COVID secure, and so on and so on. So how do surely universities are going to get a bailout of some sort. And what's clear is, and I'm not suggesting there was a secret meeting where someone said this is what's going to happen, but it may as well have done, universities got their bailout, and the bailout was, if you recruit the number of students you normally recruit, that is going to save you, and the government will help you recruit students. We will toddle along to UCAS days and tell people they should definitely apply. Business as usual. We'll help sell international education around the world. We'll try to reassure students. As long as students still apply and still come to university in September 2020, that will be the income that you really need, higher education sector, to get through a difficult year. And the basic theory there was that, unlike, for instance, the pub trade or the theatre business, because pubs couldn't recruit people, right? Pubs couldn't get people through the door, and theatres couldn't get people through the door. So some sectors you really do have to support with economic stimulus and furlough schemes and so on. But the basic assumption was, if higher education could still recruit students, give students something of an experience and still charge full fees, that was its bailout. And so effectively, the decision was kind of collectively made that as long as students still turned up, that was the bailout, that would keep the show on the road, and so on and so on. Now, you might argue, quite reasonably, that what that potentially resulted in is two things: being promised things that people couldn't deliver in the end, and perhaps reasonably, with a bit of hindsight chucked in, could never deliver. And also a lack of an insurance policy if some of the assumptions went wrong, by which I mean, I don't think anyone in August thought we would be in lockdown today, but someone could have predicted that it was one of the scenarios, but nobody at the time decided to factor in that that might result in students being asked not to return to Egham and having to pay for accommodation that they can't use. So two things were sort of missing. One, what if all this goes wrong? What if, we end up with another lockdown? What if we can't deliver the blended learning we said we are now promising this summer? And what if all of it gets worse, and so on and so on? And you may well argue that that means that students have been kind of left in the lurch, really, in terms of, paying full price for stuff that hasn't been delivered. Now, let me just cover a few bits on the system and value for money, and then I'll kind of stop and take questions. First thing I want to just talk about is how the system works, if you like, at government level. So politics tends to view higher education as big school and the responsibility of DfE, that's the Department for Education, Gavin Williamson's department, and parents. And that means a lot of the chat is about young first degree home students, undergraduates, with some PGT mixed in. And there are only really two sorts of student in public consciousness: Harry Potter HE and nurses. So Harry Potter turns up at the start of term, goes home at the end of term, fairly young. Nursing students, mature, getting their bursaries. Okay. But what's fascinating about all of that is that over the years, the assumption about who's responsible for students has drifted towards universities and DfE. So, for example, if I look at the last 10 times that the question of employment support for students, you know, the fact that students have got no money and no part-time work, and whether or not they should be able to claim universal credit. If I look at the last 10 times that's been raised in Parliament, people haven't been asking DWP, Department of Work and Pensions ministers, they've been asking education ministers. The assumption is that student financial support is provided through universities. If I think about housing, Robert Jenrick, the housing minister, hasn't been asked lots of questions about student housing and rent. It's been Gavin Williamson and Michelle Donnellan, the universities minister. The assumption is universities are the ones that are responsible for and looking after all student housing. Similarly, if you look at PGR funding extensions, I don't see ministers at business, energy, industry and so on, you know, being pressured. It's DfE. And student mental health, you hardly hear a health minister talk about student mental health. The assumption is it's the university that has to pay. So as well as all the things I've described, we have sleptwalked into a system where the working assumption is that your tuition fee income, your 9,250 or your international student fee income, will pay for everything: employment support, housing support when things go wrong, PGR funding extensions, mental health rather than the NHS. And the problem with that model is that while it's difficult in the best of times, we are not in the best of times. And now that we're in the middle of a pandemic, the working assumption is that support for the fact that students have no jobs, support for the fact that students have got to pay their rent, support for their mental health, all of it has got to be found from tuition fee income. So that puts real pressure on the system and arguably is outrageous when it's various other government departments that ought to be helping and paying. Now, let me answer a few questions that I always get before I take some real questions. First is, why do we have this system? Why don't we just have a graduate tax, or why don't we just have free education? Interestingly, one of the reasons we have this system is that student loans used to be assumed to be fully repaid, and we only used to account for them when they got written off. So that meant it was all right to sort of let higher education expand, to convert grants into loans, to let it be 9,000 rather than 7,500, and to run it as a tuition fee and loan system because it flattered the government's books. The government would never have to show how much the system was starting to cost because it only used to recognise the loss at 30 years at the write-off period. And this started to look like a bit of a scam, right? And interestingly, statisticians from Europe, when we were still part of the EU, got in touch with our government and said, you can't run this scam anymore. You know, it looks really bad. And so now Treasury officials are really worried about the cost of the system. But that's why we had a fee and loan system. And that's why people weren't worried about all these costs going up and starting to balloon in the early part of the decade. It's also now, though, why the Treasury turns around to higher education and says, you've got to pay for all this stuff like mental health and rent support and student hardship funding and so on and so on. But look, back from a student point of view, one of the other questions you asked me is, what are students getting for the money? And I used to run this exercise when I would visit a university with a group, you know, I would talk to groups of students. And you know, back in the days of British Home Stores, when this was a real department store, I would say to students, what do you get when you buy higher education, when you buy something from British Home Stores? And they would say, well, Jim, you buy shoes or clothes or food or eyebrow threading or accessories or luggage or gifts. And then I would ask, what's on offer at university? What are you buying when you buy a university course? And they would talk about other things like friends and employment prospects and connections and intellectual capacity and personal development. And I think that's fascinating. I think it's fascinating because the reality is the stuff on the left-hand side of your screen right now are things. And the stuff on the right-hand side are the benefits of things. So you could just as easily list what you're paying for at BHS as style, sophistication, to be respected by your peers for being fashionable. I'm not sure you would at British Home Stores, but you know what I mean. And you could just as easily on the right-hand side list a bunch of things like tables, chairs, Wi-Fi, somewhere to sit on campus, the staff salaries of the people that teach you, right? But what we tend to do in higher education, or at least what universities tend to do, is talk about these wider benefits of HE, whereas we obviously, when we're buying things, talk about things. Now, I could put that another way. There are the financials that surround inputs, things like time and effort and planning and staffing. There are financials that surround outputs, tables and chairs and Wi-Fi and buildings and contact hours with academics. There are outcomes, things like confidence, the fact that you get your degree, the experience you've had if you were given experience in a lab or a studio or on work experience or on year abroad or something. And then there are impacts of all of that, your salary in later life, your happiness, your life satisfaction, and so on. And each of those has financials kind of attached to it, I guess. What I would say is that when you ask students what it represents value for money, what are they assessing when they say value for money? Students, for fairly obvious reasons, aren't talking about impacts. And they're often not really talking about outcomes. For students, the research tells us that students worry about the stuff, the teaching, the space, the Wi-Fi, the facilities, the stuff, right? The stuff that happens on campus. And you know what that means is, and I led a bunch of research about students and value for money a couple of years ago. When you ask students whether they think they've had value for money, they reflect on the stuff. They reflect on the stuff they can touch, taste, see, and experience, quite rightly. In other words, if you turn up to Alton Towers, the theme park, and all of the rides are closed, and because of a pandemic, you are asked to watch those rides on YouTube videos, the Alton Towers costs may well have still been really high. But because you didn't get what you were promised in terms of getting on the rides, you will regard that as poor value for money. So it depends on the optic, yeah? And from a student optic, inevitably this year has represented poor value for money. And, you know, as I say, I've done research with comments like this. I'll send you these slides. But what we do know about student value for money perceptions is this. Dissatisfaction is focused on facilities, services, and experiences that were promised. Does all of this work for me? How much of it am I getting? Do I know where the money goes? So think about COVID-19. This is not working for lots of students. There isn't a lot of it, or at least there feels like there's not a lot of it because there's nothing else to focus on because you're not on the bus joining clubs and societies in a part-time job. So all you've got to focus on is the 5 or 6 or 9 hours contact a week that you get. So it will feel like less in context, and not knowing where the money goes. All of those have been significantly exacerbated by COVID-19. And we were already in a position where only 40% of undergraduates felt they were getting value for money, right? So when you take all of that, you add to the fact that students are upset about hidden costs at university, the cost of joining clubs and societies, the cost of photocopying things in the library, the cost of rent is still a huge surprise to lots of students, particularly when they get out into the private sector. Add to that, then the fact that lots of those things have been paid for that they've not been able to experience. The most obvious and signature one being paying for rent on properties that Michelle Donnellan has asked you to not move back into. And you end up with significant dissatisfaction this year in relation to value for money that may well only turn around much later in life when people feel that they've made an investment in their wider education and career. In other words, universities would like students to focus on the stuff in the bottom right-hand corner here, the stuff about wider life benefits, But the truth is, you can't really think about those things if you feel you're being ripped off and you feel you're not getting the stuff you were promised. And that tends to be hygiene and maintenance factors like access to campus, access to hours of teaching, and so on and so on. Now, where does all of that sort of get us to? Let me quickly skip through these. This is broadly the same points, and so on and so on. Now, because of the system we have, which, as I said earlier, is a tuition fee that goes to a university that pays for a set of things, consumer protection law applies. Students are paying for a set of services that then help them to achieve a degree. By the way, students are definitely not paying for a degree. It has to be possible for students to pay full price and still fail. Yeah, so students are paying for a set of stuff that helps them achieve a degree and some wider outcomes like confidence and friendship and social capital and so on. Consumer protection law would have it that providers of services have to tell people the characteristics of the services they're offering and then have to deliver to those characteristics. And providers can't hide information or give misleading information about that service. Providers have some limited permissions to vary and offer alternatives in the event of an act of God, an emergency, a strike, a global pandemic, certainly last spring. And in time, once that excuse kind of runs out, providers have to get consent to change what's being delivered and offer alternatives if it can't deliver what it has promised. Now, you might be sat there on the other end of this call, if you're still listening, hopefully you're still listening, thinking, so I'm a student and the people I represent are students, and we all paid for a set of services to achieve the degree and the wider outcomes. And the university told us about lots of the characteristics of what was on offer, like the fantastic campus and facilities and campus Wi-Fi and face-to-face teaching, and lots of things were offered to you, right, when you were wheeled around on your open day, hopefully in lovely weather. And some of you might be thinking, well, hold on, I'm not sure. Was the university scenario planning a full lockdown last August? I mean, it probably should have been. It probably should have warned us, right? And some of you might be thinking, hold on, no one got my permission to change the offer. No one wrote to me and said, do you hereby agree that this year, because of the pandemic, it might all be rubbish? Yeah. And some of you might be thinking, well, hold on. Some of this, I need alternatives offered, and the alternatives that have been offered, some of them have been fine, but some of them have been either not there or have been atrocious, particularly if you were promised anything vaguely practical, like a studio space or time in the lab or work experience or a year abroad, or, those things that are really practical and are really hard to recreate online. I've said it before, I'll say it again. There are lots of things you can do online. A year abroad is not one of them. You might still be able to learn conversational French by watching lots of YouTube videos, but it's not the same as being in France. Yeah, so you might be sat there thinking, well, hold on, I've been failed as a consumer here. Now, there are lots of things about consumer protection. Clearly, in relation to the student to university agreement, the teaching and the assessment is the most important bit. The practical components are fairly important. Wider facilities and services like campus Wi-Fi in the middle of a pandemic, probably less important, although still important. And then wider experiences like friendship and is probably in the same realm as hoping that you could sue a holiday company if the weather turns out bad when you go to Mallorca, right? And the truth is that students have definitely paid for the teaching and assessment that was advertised. They've probably paid for the practical components they were offered. They've sort of paid for the wider facilities and services. The wider experiences, perhaps less so. The question that no one knows the answer to, because it's not been through the courts, is how much of all of that you can demand in the context of a global pandemic. How much of it is reasonable to demand? And once it becomes reasonable to demand it, if a university can't provide it, how reasonable is it that the university funds an alternative and or then funds a refund? And for all the reasons I've set out previously in this presentation, if every single student at Royal Holloway successfully complained and got a partial refund, the university would probably collapse. So that presents real moral dilemmas. Do you just sort of go for it anyway because you don't owe other students anything? Do you owe the university because it's a charity and you're loyal to it and you want to prop up higher education? Do you owe your student community? Do you only really go for this if you've been really badly affected? You know, some students have been affected more than others. Some courses have been affected more than others. Is it selfish to really demand a massive fee refund in all of this context? Or is it perfectly reasonable? It's not your fault the university decided to kind of fill its halls, fill its coffers, take all of those risks last August and didn't warn you. I can't answer any of those questions for you, either about your personal morality, your morality as a student representative, or indeed your morality as a student body, you know, from the perspective of the full-time officers, the SABs in the Students' Union that are on this call today. I can't resolve those moral conflicts for you. You have to find ways to do that, but they're definitely all in the mix. I think what I would say is that not everyone has been affected to the same degree, if you'll forgive the bad joke. As I say, the university probably would financially collapse if all students got compensation and refunds. That said, some students have been affected more than others. There's a really famous case at a place called Rycote Wood College, where students all got their HND in motor vehicle restoration, but in court, they said to the judge, we have our HND in motor vehicle restoration, but none of us can restore motor vehicles. Yeah, and you know, the truth is, some students on some courses in some universities are looking at what they've experienced and are thinking, I've not had what I was promised in terms of industry experience or immersion or practical experience in the lab or the studio or on the lathe or in the giant mock aeroplane at the University of Bedfordshire, where they train up students that end up flying the planes for EasyJet. You know, some students have been affected more than others, and you know, arguably, the more students have been affected in the context of a global pandemic, the more they either have a case or should make a complaint. There are big questions about how much help refunds would be for those of you that are in the undergraduate fee system, because it would just come off your loan and a lot of that loan will get written off anyway, although there are some complaint summaries that came out today that indicate that the result of some complaints means compensation rather than fee refunds. But ultimately, we do have to ask whether or not, if it is the case that lots of students haven't been given what they were promised, whether students should have to put up with that, or whether it's the university that should pay, or the government that should pay. Now, I have a personal view on this. I'm allowed a personal view. My view is the government should step in the way that it has stepped in lots of other sectors. How you persuade the government to step in is much, much more difficult. And if the way that you do it is every student in the country making a complaint, that's pretty risky. If along the way, lots of students at lots of universities end up being harmed next year and the year after because of savage cuts, and other students at other universities are at a university that ends up collapsing as a result. So I can't answer those moral questions for you, but I kind of know that they are, you know, genuinely difficult. Finally, then, just before I take questions, I do want to answer the one thing that Alyssa asked me to answer at the end, which is what would I do to support students? And here's what I would do if it was up to me and I ran the country and I ran the government and so on. First is, any student that is expecting or needing something practical that can't now be done between now and the end of the academic year, I would fund them to be able to do after the end of the academic year, both from a university point of view and from a student point of view. So do you know what? If you were promised a 6-week work placement this year and you haven't had it, I would fund you to come back to be able to take part, and I'd fund the university to be able to make sure it is still on. If you are someone who was promised they could spend time on placement and suddenly your placement is being bodged to allow you to graduate on time, I would fund you to be able to take part in that extra piece, 8 weeks of placement or whatever next academic year. And I'd also fund the university to be able to support you to do it. So in principle, I would set out to meet the original kind of expectations that you might reasonably have had of your educational outcomes that you were sold when you first applied to Royal Holloway. Second thing that I would do is I would fund a massive summer of social capital and ongoing mental health investment, by which I mean if it's the case that the weather's about to improve, I would pump significant amounts of money into your student union, into the university, to be able to run a whole summer of mainly outdoor events that get students back out meeting each other, students that have never met each other meeting each other, running projects, events, building things, making things happen. A massive summer of the sorts of things that happen on open days and in freshers weeks, that allow students to rebuild their confidence, their mental health, and, as I say, their social capital. Third thing I'd do is I'd give every student in the country a maintenance payment. It's happened in the Republic of Ireland. It's happened in Northern Ireland. It's money in your pocket. It helps the economy. It would help the fact that most students have had to shell out more on equipment and heat and light in their own rooms and laptops and desks and so on. And actually, it's a better bet than lopping money off people's debt, because lopping money off people's debt quite often doesn't help them because of that loan write-off thing. And by the way, I'd also raise the amount of money that goes into student maintenance next year, in recognition of the fact that London has got no cheaper and that families up and down the country are facing more costs as a result of the recession. So none of those are a partial or full fee refund, but hopefully, as a result of what I've talked through, you can understand why, if it was up to me, I would do those four things. And I would argue to government that those are the four things that ought to be funded and campaigned for. So with all of that, I will stop. I'm very happy now to kind of, take questions or discuss further.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, if anyone has a question, please do pop your hand up. I can see we've got some hands up, but I can't actually see who they are. So please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Jim. This is Rida here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, good.
Yeah. So thank you. That was a very enriching speech regarding a lot of issues being faced by students right now. My question to you is the point where you raised about the fact that you would want the government to intervene and would in one way fund into a massive summer. Um, how would this be executed in your opinion? And after the entire COVID, after the whole pandemic, the students have undergone. Uh, how are the students going to ensure that their safety is not compromised? And how will they come back to the landscape? That is what I mean to say,
Yeah, well, look, it's a good set of questions. I mean, the first thing I'd say is there is a contemporary debate, if you open the papers, if you read the news websites, about learning loss and the impact on students in every other part of education, right? So people are worried about learning loss in nursery and at primary and secondary and in FE colleges. No one talks about learning loss or the impacts on higher education students, and that's partly because universities don't want to admit there's been any, in case they have to then shell out a tuition fee refund, right? So getting that conversation onto the agenda is important. Now, the way to solve it, you'll have noticed in schools, has been a big injection of cash into a summer catch-up programme. And I guess what I'm saying is, I think there ought to be an equivalent summer catch-up programme, but for higher education students. Now, it's all pandemic dependent. We've still got to maintain a level of social distancing. You would need the summer to be really, summery. You'd need to be able to spend some time outdoors more than lots and lots of people packed indoors. And you'd need the vaccination programme to be going as well as it's going. And you need to have vaccinated everyone as fast as we think we're going to be able to, without the new variants causing a big problem. But nevertheless, if all of that happened, what I would do is I'd give a wedge of money to every university in the country to then work with their student union, with student reps and so on, to enable students to make things happen, to put on events, to run projects, to engage with employers, almost a kind of summer of everything you do outside of your course that you've not been able to do outside of your course this year because you've all been trapped in your individual rooms, and therefore almost the only thing that's happened for most students has been their course on Zoom or Teams. So a big catch up on all the other things that we tend to get out of university, but delivered over the summer, with appropriate social distancing and a big budget to help it happen.
Well, we all sincerely hope that this is what actually happens, and we are looking forward to it. Yes. with open arms. Thank you.
Thank you. Ginny, I think you have your hand up.
Yes, hi. I was wondering if you have any advice on how we could use this information to put some pressure on staff where we don't feel they're really giving us what we were promised. My course has had an entire module cut without any notification to students in advance. We've had about half of our lectures cut. So really looking for anything.
Look, in principle, what I would say is what the Office of the Independent Adjudicator, which is the National Complaints Ombudsperson, would say is that whilst it recognises that some students have had to have the delivery method changed of what was promised, in theory, they should still have the equivalent of what was promised, even if it's had to be delivered in a different way. So, for example, one of the complaint summaries that came out this morning on the OIA website said a student had missed a bunch of teaching during the strikes a couple of years ago when academics went on strike. And some of that teaching could be replaced, some of it couldn't. And OIA has given them a compensation payment because some of it couldn't be replaced. Now, if I was a student or a student rep, of course, on one level, it would be nice if someone said, we recognise we haven't delivered what we promised, and we'll write you a cheque for some money, here's some money. But actually, what underpins that is something that a student has lost. And I think what you've just described to me is that you've lost something. You've lost an experience that you wanted to experience. And the reality is, it is going to be easier for universities and for you to have a conversation about replacing what was lost when it's possible, if it's possible, rather than a conversation which is, can you give me £2,100 or whatever it is that you want back? So, look, it's not too late for universities to do really interesting things after Easter. It's not too late for universities to do, enable students to kind of catch up and experience some of these things that they've lost next academic year, even though they've lost them this academic year, as long as students are continuing into next academic year. It's not too late for universities to put in place measures that recognise that on the ground, not everything has been subject to equivalent delivery. What I would say is that unless students and students' unions are raising the most egregious examples of that, it will be easier for universities to just let the year end, to issue people in their final year with their degree certificate and get on with next year. Of course it will be easier, right? Of course it would be easier. And in a way, I think what student representation and student unions are for at this point is probably less about give me £2,000 or £5,000 or whatever the fee refund is. It's probably about, if you as a student feel that you have lost something, you've not, had the experiences that you signed up for, then you are going to work with the university to make sure that at some point soon, there is still an opportunity for you to experience those things. And as I say, I think they're different for different students, and I think they're different on different courses. I was particularly struck, I think, by one of the complaint summaries that came out this morning, where a final year international medical student at a university somewhere said and had complained that they had lost weeks and weeks on placement, training to be a doctor. But they'd still, because the pandemic hit last March, been allowed to become a doctor. Their argument was because they'd lost all the experience on the ward, when they were applying for jobs in the future, that's a real loss. So even though they hadn't lost in terms of their degree, they'd lost the experience that was promised. And OIA agreed and said that in the future, universities need to find ways to make that up to people. So look, the academic year hasn't finished, even though it's pretty close. Where you or colleagues or students that either because of their personal circumstances or because of the way in which the course runs, haven't had the things that were promised, then you should definitely raise it. However, if there are some students who are, in the end, complaining more about the fact that there's been a global pandemic than about the fact that the university hasn't delivered something that was promised, then there's also probably a role for you and for the full-time officers and for the students' union to say, look, I know it's been difficult, but there has been a pandemic and we don't want to collapse the university. Now, again, do I know where to draw the line between those two things? I don't. Do I know where you should draw the line between those two things? I don't. But I do think that both of those positions are equally valid. You've just got to work out where to draw the line on a given day and with a given group of students.
I was just wondering if, based on your experience, bringing up these complaints in the context of how similar complaints have been addressed in the past could be used to put pressure on staff, because I've been organizing supplementary lectures with outside lecturers when the staff could have done that just as easily.
Well, look, I guess the other thing I would say is it would be strange for, and I understand why you're doing it and why you framed it like that. It would be strange to put the pressure directly on staff. This really is a management issue. It's about the way the university is being managed, the way, labour is being distributed, the way, academic time is being sorted and so on. A complaint to the university centrally is going to be an important thing, I think, to do. And it might not be a formal complaint yet. It might be something that you raise through the student officers or, something that you make semi-formal. But, the important thing, I think, is to say, here's what we didn't experience that we said we were going to experience. This isn't about the fact you've had to do it on Zoom. This is about the fact that it just hasn't happened. And it's the stuff that hasn't happened that is the stuff that really matters.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Ginny as well, I'd probably say if you can drop myself or one of the officers a line about what you mentioned at the start as well, we can look at supporting you in that aspect, and links to the SU Advice Centre as well. That would be really helpful, and we can look at how we can support you further there.
I will absolutely do that. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions from anybody? Adriana, go ahead.
Yes, hi there. So I don't know if this is a little bit off topic, but thinking specifically on EU students, what do you think the impact will be in universities with COVID and with Brexit? Are universities expecting that the EU students are going to magically transform into international students? Will this all come and, bite them later on? Is this something that could cause the collapse of universities, this year, next year?
Well, I mean, look, there weren't that many students from the EU in UK universities to start with. The students that were already here from Europe will continue to have broadly similar status. The real problem is new European students will be put off by the fact they're suddenly international students, having to pay international student fees, having to pay the NHS surcharge, being treated generally badly by the UK government, by a hostile environment towards immigrants, and so on and so on. The tragedy, I think, is that overall what will happen is that UK university campuses will just be less European. There'll be less people from Europe on our campuses. That's partly because of these big changes to fees, but also because of the changes to Erasmus, the replacement with a much, diminished scheme in the form of the Turing scheme and so on. And look, there's nothing wrong with, wanting to attract international students from all around the world. But if the net impact is that without really noticing, our campuses in the UK become much, much less European, and we end up sending as a country far fewer students to Europe too, that, I certainly feel some sadness about that from the point of view of being a proud Europhile. Now, not every citizen, not every student at Royal Holloway, not every academic, not every staff member is a proud Europhile, but certainly I am. And I think, what we are going to have to do is, both generally and specifically in terms of funding policies and future developments of agreements and so on, is redouble our efforts to try to make sure that students from the UK are still studying, at least for a part of the time, in some European universities and vice versa.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you. I'll take final questions now, just because I am conscious of time. So, Rita, you have your hand up.
Yeah, hi again. So my question is on behalf of the international students. There is a new scheme that has come up regarding giving international students 2 years to find the right job or right opportunity to work in the UK. Now, no one expected a pandemic this year. I wanted to ask the students who will be graduating this year, how will this how will the scheme work with this whole new development of a pandemic? And will that reduce the chances of international students to find jobs in the UK? I mean,
yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good questions. Look, yes, it will be harder for everyone to get a job in the next year. International students aren't kind of immune to that. And the pandemic is particularly hitting young people, graduate jobs, and so on and so on. The good news is that a fiercely protectionist government might have, in different circumstances, turned around and just unilaterally abolished the post-study work graduate route on the basis that it wanted to save more jobs for people from the UK, sort of thing. They haven't done that. However, students that are due to graduate this summer have got to be in the country by April. And are currently, in order to take advantage of the graduate route, but yet are currently being told by the Department for Education, if they're not in the country, to not come. And that has to solve itself soon. It's the 2nd of March. So, you know, next month, if students that aren't back in the country or in the country yet on a 1-year course, if they're not here by mid-April, I think the date is, they're not going to be able to get onto that graduate route. And that is quite worrying, I think, because in the end, if someone in the Home Office doesn't sort that out with someone in the Department for Education, we will suddenly find ourselves in a position where potentially hundreds of thousands of international students who are not back in the UK right now, that, as I say, are graduating this summer, will suddenly find that they're not entitled to be on the graduate route. And that would be outrageous in terms of what they've been kind of promised and told to expect.
Right. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Jim. It's been a really interesting and fascinating talk, and I'm really appreciative of you coming, as I'm sure everyone else is as well. Just to make everyone aware as well, the recording will be available in case you have peers who have missed it, so I definitely encourage them to check that out as well. For the rest of Rep Conference, we have a joint honours focus group tomorrow, and we're holding a BAME student experience workshop on the Thursday, so please do come along to that if you're free. But overall, yeah, thank you so much, Jim, for coming. This has been really informative and helpful, and thanks for giving up your time this evening.
Pleasure. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.